It was late in the evening when the doctor made the first incision. He was alone. He had been a medical examiner for a long time, but he had never seen a body that looked quite like this before. He stood still over it with his scalpel in hand, contemplating. It looked at first glance like a statue, a beautiful object, the pale flesh marbling at the chest and wrists. He placed his scalpel down, turned around and picked up the file, opening it and setting it on the cold metal desktop. He picked up a pen, medical examiner, Dr. Noah Zara Lang. His mother, who had left him and his father when he was young, had written a doctoral thesis on Dadaism and had chosen his middle name. He never thought about it really, except sometimes when he found himself mouthing the word, repeating it, Zara, 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 sometimes pronouncing the T, Zarat, Zarat, Zara. But that happened very rarely. He preferred working alone in silence. Some of his colleagues liked chatter, music, talk radio. He would stay late when he could. The exam room had an echo to it. The sound of a dropped instrument would reverberate, church-like. But tonight he didn't like the quiet or the solitude. The body was unnerving. It threatened to cross a boundary as if not properly dead, and he was the kind of man who separated the elements of his life as neatly as he could, work, pleasure, inside, outside, who weighed, labeled, and stored exactly and properly, who disposed of perishable foods as soon as they reached their expiration dates, and whose hands were chapped because he washed them so often. He pressed the scalpel against the skin of the dead man, half expecting it not to yield. A line of blood bloomed instead, half frozen, granular. Lang was a man of science, but in that first incision, a fleeting feeling arose, complex, multifaceted, yet fleeting nonetheless. All the compartments of his life began to collapse into one another, his own flesh opening beneath the instrument, his insides mixing with the air around him. A word he hated, contamination, exposure. He nearly pulled the scalpel away, but the thing passed, he relaxed. He'd had a coffee later than normal, he was just jittery. This body is very well preserved, remarkably so, but that's no cause for alarm. These things happen. He shook his head side to side a little, and as he returned steadily to the performance of tasks that had long ago become habitual, the slicing, the peeling back, the extracting, the measuring, the stitching back together, his mind began to wander, the film of memory beginning to play. The face of the woman who had come to identify the body pressed against his mind intermittently, and maybe against other parts of his body, which he tried to remedy by thinking of his wife, Kitty. A mistake. There was her face overlaid over the face of his wife. There was his wife in the room with him, reaching out to touch. He felt guilty and tried to think of something else. He thought of the documentary Kitty was watching the other night, where a character, a doctor, described the first time he witnessed a patient's death. I heard it, he said earnestly, the whoosh. The doctor became more distracted more easily these days. He had been doing the same job for a long time. His mind drifted, the same way one's will when driving on a long, straight road past unremarkable scenery. Sometimes he would drift off, and when he came to, he would notice with some alarm that he had carried out an entire procedure nearly without realizing. But he always did it right. He was the chief medical examiner, and he was very good at his job. Once, though, he had found himself paused, literally, with his scalpel suspended in a man, what had once been a man's, liver. It really was as if someone had pressed a button, as if time had stood still, only beginning to move again when his assistant banged the door open on his way back in. A strange specificity to it, not just that the world had stopped, but also that he had stopped, his insides stilled, blood ceasing to circulate, the power cut off from his nervous system. Since then, he tried to keep his mind engaged when he was working. It had been the same when he was a child. His aunt used to take him to church every Sunday, and he would look up at the vaulted wooden ceiling and think that it looked like the bottom of a boat, a great big boat, and he could imagine rows of men in the boat rowing and rowing, but there he went again. He did have a strategy to keep focused. The thing that worked best, that he had come to enjoy the most, was imagining himself as a kind of psychopomp easing dead souls from one world to the next. A grandiose fantasy, maybe, but he did not otherwise suffer from grandiosity, delusions, or otherwise. In this fantasy, his examination room became a dark, hushed space between life and death, and only he was able to negotiate the passage to slip between the two places. He was not authoritarian, but comforting, not a doctor, but a guide, kind, composed, patient. Deep down, the doctor wasn't such a man of science. But to just look at him, you would not see the playfulness, the child he never got to be, so hidden that even he could not see it. The dead man was young. Well, not that young, but too young to be dead. Lang took his glove off and wrote, cause of death, drowning. He would have written accidental drowning, but the back and side of the man's head appeared to have been hit or struck with some force. Hit or struck, the doctor could not tell yet. That part wasn't up to him anyway. He just had to explain what he could see. The story was up to them. Blood alcohol content, 0.18%, staggeringly drunk, can't have been in water long, no decomposition, body not bloated. Lang went back to the table. Yes, his features appeared almost sharpened by death. He was a beautiful man, whoever he had been, now a beautiful corpse, his eyelids lightly shut as if he were in an easy sleep. Grainy purple bruising around his hairline, darkening into an open wound at his temple. Lang reached out, pressing his fingers lightly against the man's cheek, along his jawbone, his throat, his collarbone. Death, as he usually experienced it, made people look less human. More often than not, their humanity became completely unrecognizable. He prodded the wound open a little with his scalpel, a thin flap of skin peeling back to reveal a gray-red nexus and deeper, dust-like fragments of bone. The bruises moved away from the site in strange tendrils, blooming across the white, smooth skin. At any moment, it seemed a blush could return to his cheeks. The blood would begin to flow, red and fresh, spilling from his open temple, as if he could still be resuscitated, a statue on the verge of movement. Now that he had gone some time without thinking of the woman who was named Lolita but had told him immediately to call her Lola, he should be allowed to think of her again, at least for a little while. She wasn't a family member. She was the dead man's emergency contact at the university where he worked. She had sat across from the doctor at the lacquered table, one hand folded over the other, her gaze turned down, brow creasing and uncreasing. I'm his closest friend, she said. Lang placed a photograph face down on the table and told her to take all the time she needed, but she didn't even wait a second before turning it over. Something in her face froze when she looked at it, and when she spoke again, her voice came from far away. Through it all, even as the tears began to pool in her eyes, not yet in fall, Lang took a moment to consider her aesthetically. Her heart's broken, just look at her. Can I see the body? Her voice startled him. He hadn't seen her lips move. Of course, he said, standing and leading her through to the examination room. She brushed by him as she walked through the door. Lola, L-O-L-A, Lola. In the room, she didn't cry. She didn't make any sound at all. Lang watched her from the doorway. She stood next to the body by the head and spent a long time looking down at the face. She reached out and unzipped the heavy bag a little more, exposing the narrow column of his throat. She touched his cheek, his throat, all the while poised and still. Lang watched her. He watched the pulse jump in her neck. She was so slim that her clothes shielded the shape of her body from his view. His mind wandered. After a few minutes, she walked past him out of the room, and he waited before shutting the door behind her. At the sound, she turned and looked at him startled. Can you zip him back up, she said. I don't like the thought of him exposed like that. She was authoritative. His heart rate increased. He agreed, submitting to her request, which he heard as an instruction. When he came back out into the hall, she was standing where he had left her. She looked at him like she was really seeing him for the first time, not in a romantic way, but in a real way, as if she was committing his face to memory. He met her eyes, seeing in them another world, and in the fine movements of her hands as she lifted them, taking her left wrist in her right hand. He thought of holding on to her wrist, of her looking at him the same way she looked at the dead man, of her touching his throat, his face. Before she left, he gave her his card and said to call if she needed anything, an unusual protocol. He held his hand out and she took it, squeezed it. There was no softness to her, no yield. Her perfume lingered. His phone interrupted the memory, vibrating harshly on the metal side table. What a terrible noise. He looked at it, a message from Kitty asking him about dinner, which made him feel bad. He had another hour of work left. It had been a long day. He was behind on everything, but that was not new. Now he was tired, and it was so quiet. He put his phone on another countertop farther away, flicking it onto silent. He would enjoy the quiet a little longer. Earlier, he had been hungry and hadn't had a chance to eat. But now in the room, the needs of his body were fading away, overcome by the silence, the stillness, the precision of each cut, the weighing of each organ, extraction of fluids, injection of different fluids. As he continued working, images unfurled themselves in his head. The perfume, her ghostly presence. No, he was not that kind of man. He had always stayed faithful to his wife, but still he recalled her long white raincoat, the way she took her wrist in her hand, pressing her thumb to the base of her palm, the fine lines around her eye, her mouth, her head falling back, her eyes shut, back bared, the indent of her spine, his fingers pressing against the arch of her foot, the pulse leaping in her throat. These thoughts had no language attached to them. They were pure image. That way he didn't have to feel too guilty for what he could not control. What you need, he imagined the dead man saying to him, are metaphors. He looked at the face of the dead man, still untouched. The lightness with which his eyes and lips were shut was like the expression of the Buddha, still but evoking some flutter of inner life. I'm sorry for all this, he thought in reply, finishing suturing the incision that ended at the right shoulder. I know that no one imagines their life ending like this, an airless room, a stranger's hands, and your body here all opened up in a way no one can really imagine until they've actually seen it. It's not like on TV. There are things they leave out in those programs, the sound of the rib cutter, the empty coffee cup by the sink, the lack of drama. Are there no surprises? I leave no room for them, the doctor thought. This is not the kind of job where one can be permeable to horror. There is a feeling sometimes like biting down on metal, but you can't linger on it. The dead man responded, this is not how I imagined it, but then I don't know what I imagined. Perhaps that there would be a window, though maybe a frosted one. Maybe that it would be daytime. Yes, I imagine natural light or maybe dirty yellow light like a Rembrandt. Most people, Lang thought, would think of a blue light and the rest of the room are all dark, like on a cop show. I never watched any of them. This lighting is horrible. Anything else would be better. He was in a rhythm. He would normally have put the body away because all he had to do now was fluid analysis, but he didn't want to interrupt the game. I agree, he said, this time out loud, quietly, but it is not my decision. If I'm being honest, Lang paused, his imagination failing for a moment. He looked at the dead man's face for an answer. Time was running out. He was almost finished. He reached out and touched the hairline. The bruising was in places dark red. Before death, surely, he thought, but he was also unsure. Bruising was tricky. There was a woman in his department who made it her specialty. He would hand the examination over to her tomorrow, maybe. What could he have hit his head on in the water, hard enough to cause this kind of bruise, hard enough to tear open the skin? Oh, there he was. I had hoped that my body would not be found. He was overwhelmed by fatigue. It was time to put the body away. He would finish writing everything up tomorrow morning. Maybe he would even be in work early. Getting that drunk, he thought, was a good substitute for filling your pockets with stones. He didn't like his bruise colleague. She was younger than everyone else, and her research had gotten some traction, and these things made her smug. Lang was no longer comforting or guiding the dead man at this point. He wasn't kind or patient or composed. The man had probably moved on to the next world just fine without his help, and he would rather be home with his wife, who had probably ordered dinner in the end and was likely deep into one of her violent TV shows, which she had been watching obsessively lately, even though she always fell asleep in front of them. He wanted to be with her, though, even if she was half asleep, not stuck there in this fluorescent lit room, between life and death, and his metaphors all gone, and this bruising, this delicate skin of his temples splitting open. Thank you very much.